Hey guys, Red Gambit here with something which I'm going to do as a semi-regular thing on my channel. Given how well the Sunset Overdrive review was received, I want to share with you my thoughts and impressions on other games that I'm playing for the first time, and hopefully give you a little insight from a guy who just loves to play good games and immersive video games. So I'm calling this a rant view because I feel like trying to stick exclusively to the traditional formula of introduction, positive comments, negative comments, and conclusion is a little too restrictive. So I'm really just going to talk about my feelings playing the game, my impressions, my overall thoughts, and so forth. Now, there are going to be some fairly big spoilers ahead, so if you want to play the game yourself, I would recommend skipping this until you've had a chance to do so. So, Evil Within is a game by Shinji Mikami, a director who has a long history of working within the Japanese video game industry, having worked on influential titles like Resident Evil and Devil May Cry. He's probably most famous for working on Resident Evil 4, which, as you probably know, is a game that's very near and dear to my heart. So this alone was enough for me to want to go out and purchase this game for my Xbox One. Now, if you don't know anything about the game, Evil Within is a story about an officer named Sebastian Castellanos and his two companions who investigate a mass murder at a nearby hospital, only to be quickly dragged into a nightmare world of flesh beasts, monsters, and aberrations, which he and his colleagues need to, obviously, escape from. Evil Within is built on the backbone of the ID's id Tech Engine 5, which you may know is most famous being used in their game Rage. So this game has some great graphical polish to it. There's very little pop-in, and I would say that the game ran solidly at around 30 frames per second for most of the time that I was playing it. In terms of mechanics, this is a survival horror game through and through. On normal difficulty, the game makes sure that ammo is painfully scarce at times, and on more than one occasion I found myself practically defenseless as I struggled to search every corner of the game for just one more bullet. It really gives you a great sense of accomplishment when you're carrying a good amount of ammunition around with you, because if you are, you know you're doing well and you're not desperately scratching for bullets at every opportunity. It's also a very challenging game. In my 20-hour playthrough, I died no less than 157 times. This is partially because the game makes no effort to hold your hand. Early on, you'll be given matches which can be used to burn bodies and or objects, but it's up to you to figure out the best use for them. That is actually to finish off a downed opponent who is lying prone on the floor from probably being shot in the face. Guns, ammo capacity, and your vital stats can all be upgraded, but I couldn't find an easy way to break the game. Even upgrading the standard crossbow bolts to their maximum capacity at my earliest convenience couldn't break the game in any way that I could see visibly. As finding materials for the bolts is always very challenging and carries a certain degree of risk, since it's mostly involved in disarming traps and bombs that can blow up in your face. Speaking of which, the Agony crossbow is a great mechanic on the developer's part. Being given access to a wide array of different bolts allows you to tailor the combat to whatever suits your style. Personally, I upgraded the standard bolts to level 5, which results in one-shot kills on any target that's not a boss, as well as the explosive bolts which can be placed strategically around an area as proximity mines. Now, here's where the review is going to start getting a little bit ranty. I didn't like this game, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, obviously this is just my opinion, and I'm sure a lot of people will disagree, but I think I'll be able to explain myself pretty well here. If I was going to surmise the game, I would say it felt like a child of Silent Hill and Resident Evil with all the looks, but none of the charisma of its parents. This game has a few problems, but by far the biggest are the graphics. Even looking at the video here, you can see two features that are going to jump out right away. Firstly, the game runs in letterbox even if you're playing on a widescreen TV, and honestly, why wouldn't you be? This by itself has probably been added to give a sense of claustrophobia and or artistic merit, but it limits your field of view, which in a game which requires you to shoot is never a good thing. Especially during the game's two turret sequences, you'll find it quite challenging to see just what's going on past the iron sight of your gun, and even during the rest of the game it just feels unnecessary. The second most striking thing about the graphics is that there is a very heavy color filter being applied at all times. The color filter tends to emphasize one color, which is usually either blue or red, while desaturating everything else. Again, I can see the reason for this, that the developers probably wanted to give everything an otherworldly quality. But for me, the combination of the two really makes this actually quite mentally taxing when playing the game for extended periods. More often than once, I felt like I needed to switch over to the TV just so I could cleanse my palate of the grimy, narrow visuals that I was being forced to absorb. This leads me to the overall aesthetic of the game, and I make no attempt to hide the fact that I am a huge fan of both Silent Hill 2 and 3. Those are both fantastic games which work on a very visual and psychological level. They get into the player's head and constantly try to play with your notion of what is real and what isn't real. Whereas Evil Within feels like it's trying to do the same thing, but ultimately fails in its attempt to really mess with the player's mind. There are definitely a few nice sort of Inception-esque sequences where the city shifts and changes, or you'll find yourself falling down a hallway, but it just feels like a wasted opportunity when this kind of game has been done far better in the past. Even the game's big bad, named The Keeper, feels like a shameless attempt to copy Silent Hill's mysterious Pyramid Head, right up to the penultimate battle, where you will encounter two keepers at once. Enemy designs don't feel particularly inspired. Most standard enemies are bad guys that are wrapped in barbed wire. Later on you'll encounter enemies who look like an aberration created by John Carpenter's The Thing, as well as bosses who follow in a similar theme of design. My problem here is that while the enemies are certainly repulsive to look at, they're far from scary. Big teeth and claws does not a scary creature make, and it's a lesson that this game hasn't really picked up on. Even the environments, which later on feature walls of pulsing flesh and organs, fail to really impress, as it just feels like the art director grew bored and decided to start throwing in more gore to ramp up the tension in lieu of anything that's interesting or creative. Sebastian himself is a remarkably obtuse character. He barely displays any emotion, and his standard disposition seems to sit somewhere between confused and gruff. His partners fare a little better, but you'll find it very difficult to care about any of them when they find themselves in peril. This is in part due to the game's narrative, which makes very little effort to try and explain itself. There are notebooks and tape recordings scattered throughout the levels, as well as flashbacks to Ruvik's past, which attempt to explain why this is all happening to Sebastian and his cohorts. But even after the end of the credits have rolled, I found myself unclear on what had happened, and I was forced to look up Wikipedia as a result. In the end, I just didn't feel engaged or drawn into this game's story. If Mikami wanted this game to feel like a physical ordeal which the player had to force their way through, then he's definitely achieved that, but I feel like it was at the expense of delivering any real enjoyment from the game. Now don't get me wrong, Evil Within is not a bad game by any stretch. The combat requires you to use a lot of creative thinking, and it rewards you for playing smart instead of wasting your ammunition. It's also a very big game. As I mentioned, my first playthrough was just shy of 20 hours, and for people who are completionists, there are dozens of statues hidden throughout the game which can be used for unlocking extra ammunition and upgrade items, which I affectionately named Jamba Juice, once you finish the game. Once you finish the game, you'll also unlock several new items to try out, along with a new difficulty level to try them out on. However, overall, I just feel like this was a wasted opportunity. For something which takes place in an Inception-esque dream, you have free reign to do anything and whatever you want. I mean, you can mess with the player without any need to justify why any of it can happen, but instead we're limited to several mundane locations, including city streets, a construction site, and the token hospital, mowing down wave after wave of enemies who barely function differently from one another. Overall, I would say the game is above average. If you're a fan of this kind of game or the horror genre, then by all means pick it up. You're probably going to derive a much more enjoyable experience from it than I did. But if you think you'll be experiencing the second coming of Resident Evil 4, or a game which taps into the psychological roots of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, I would recommend looking somewhere else. That's it for me, guys. If you enjoyed this and would like to see more rant views of new games, then please leave a thumbs up or comment below. And until next time, I will see you guys later.